Preface of Early Days of Old Oregon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. Preface. Old Oregon was a mighty sweep of country, and a most romantic one. From the northern border of Mexican California to near Sitka in Russian America, it stretched nearly 800 miles. Eastward, it stretched over a country of mighty mountain ranges, from which at regular intervals rose the snow peaks, ever glistening white, over a country of dense forests, of mighty rivers and foaming mountain torrents, over a country of sand and sagebrush, and on still eastward over the cut-rock desert, where men had songs for supper, and where no game could live, on and on eastward, nearly 1,000 miles, until the limits of the Oregon country, at the crest of the main range of the Rockies, met the old-time, unknown Louisiana. The romance ever lingers. Still, as one stands on the green prairie at Fort Vancouver, for so many years the center of civilization on the lonely coast of Oregon, one hears echoes of the brigade of boats coming down the Columbia. Still one hears the gay voices of the voyageurs singing in time to the dip of the paddle. Romance still lingers in vague tales of the blue-coated, brass-buttoned Hudson's Bay Company men who followed the forest trails. Romance still lingers at old Fort Astoria, where a replica of the famous old fort, a tiny thing for a protection in the wilderness, has been built in memory of the old days of a century ago. "When my grandfather came across the plains," even now one hears that remark, and romance brings to sight the long line of white-winged prairie schooners winding their slow way over the endless green waves of the prairies, then over the long level of the plains, and the crashing and bumping as they plunged up and down the mountain sides, bound for Oregon. But what do the children of the present day know of the days of these grandfathers? What books have they to tell them of the old romance? None whatever. They know only that which they glean from someone else's remembrance of what their grandfathers said. One or two time-table histories, written entirely from secondary sources, and with many faulty statements, especially with regard to the claims of the British and Americans to the old Oregon country, that is all they have. I have given 4 years of devoted study to Oregon history, 3 of them among the special collections of the Northwest, and over a year in London. In England I had full access to the documents of the Public Record Office, including unpublished accounts of the various explorations, and also, what was a far rarer privilege, access to the journals, diaries, and letters of the Hudson's Bay Company. Simple as this book is, every statement is based on original authority. Comment on the British and American claims to the country is founded entirely upon sources. These sources include journals written by fur traders in the mountains and on the march, private letters between themselves, official reports of chief factors to their company in London, diplomatic correspondence of American and English diplomats, and published works, in original editions, of exploration and discovery. It has been my aim to make this volume a clear, straightforward account of the romantic discovery and settlement of Old Oregon, especially intended for children. Yet teachers of much higher grades, and perchance even those in college work, will find in the summary at the end, as well as in the 2 chapters Who Owned the Oregon Country and Fort Vancouver and Dr. John McLaughlin, material from sources which have never before been made accessible. K. B. J., Sub-Librarian of History, New York State Library, Albany, New York. End of Preface. Chapter 1 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. The First White Man's Ship. An Indian woman was one day walking along the shore near Seaside, Oregon, on her way back to the Clatsop village. Her son had been killed in battle the year before, and she often walked along this beach, wailing for him as Indians wail for their dead. Suddenly she saw something lying on the beach. She thought it might be a whale, and went toward it, because at that point her tribe caught many whales. When she came near it, she saw 2 trees standing up in this thing. She thought, "Behold, it is no whale, it is a monster." Then she reached that thing that lay on the beach. All the outside was shining as copper shines. Ropes were tied to those trees, and there were many pieces of iron sticking into it. Then a bear came out of it. He stood on the thing, near the trees. He looked just like a bear, yet his face was like that of a man. The woman was amazed. She thought this strange thing had come from the ghost land, because Indians believe in ghosts. So she at once turned away and went home, for she was afraid. As she walked on, she began to weep for her dead son. She wailed, "Oh, my son is dead, and the thing we hear about in tales is lying on the beach." As she neared the Clatsop village, her people heard the long wailing cry. The Clatsops said, "Oh, a person comes crying. Perhaps someone has struck her." They took down their bows and arrows, thinking an enemy must be near. An old man said, "Listen." The Indian woman was still weeping. She wailed, "Oh, my son is dead, and the thing we hear about in tales is lying on the beach." The Indians said, "What can it be?" They went running toward her and said, "What is it?" The woman replied, "A thing lies on the beach, and there are 2 bears in it, but they look like people." At once the warriors ran down the beach to this thing, and there it lay. Then the 2 bears came out of it with copper kettles in their hands. They put their hands to their mouths and pointed inland, giving their kettles to the Indians. They were asking for water. Some of the Indians took the kettles and ran inland to a spring or stream, but others hid themselves behind logs because they were afraid. A few were brave enough, however, to climb up into this thing. They found it like a very large canoe, and when they went down inside, it seemed full of boxes. One man who went down into the hold found there a string of brass buttons. Brass buttons had great value to his tribe, and he excitedly went outside to call his relatives. But they had already set the ship on fire. They burned this ship because they wanted the metal in it. All the Indians along the northwest coast knew metal, knew brass and iron and copper, and were very eager for it. Where they learned about it no one knows, for the earliest explorers found them willing to trade furs for bits of metal of any kind. When, therefore, they saw this ship, with its copper bottom and the nails in it, and the ironwork in the ropes, they at once set it afire to get the metal. It burned to the water's edge in a very short time, burned just like fat, so the Indians said. The Clatsop Indians also made prisoners of the 2 bears. They looked at them very hard. One of the chiefs went up to them as they stood on the beach. He looked at their faces, he looked at their hands, and then put out his own hand. Soon he said to his people that they were not bears, but men. The Indians had thought they were bears because they were bearded men. No Indian ever wears a mustache or a beard, at least not until he becomes civilized. There was great excitement among the nearby tribes when they heard about the strange canoe with 2 trees in it and all the metal. Other tribes wanted some of it. They came down in their canoes and began trading. Much of the metal was used for ornaments, for bracelets and anklets and great heavy eardrops. A strip of copper, 2 fingers wide and long enough to go around the arm, was valuable enough to buy a slave. A nail would buy a good dressed deerskin. Several nails would buy a string of hiaqua shells, which were the Indian money. The 2 sailors, of course, were made slaves. The Clatsop chief thought he ought to have both of them, but the Willapa chief demanded one, and the tribes almost went to war over it. At last the Willapa chief took one slave and the Clatsop chief kept the other. Whose ship was this? No one knows. Ships are blown across the ocean from Japan, but it does not seem likely these men were Japanese. They might have been Spaniards, or possibly Englishmen. Indeed, no one would ever have known anything at all about this ship, except that when the white men came into Oregon, the Indians themselves told them the story of this thing which lay on the beach many, many years before. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, Captain Cook's Adventures. Down from the north came a rip-roaring wind, and the two little sailing ships that, in March 1778, were off the Oregon coast had to turn and run. Reef their sails and scud before the mighty blasts. That was all captains could do in those days. The ships were very small. Without steam power, the wind blew them this way and that, and wind and tide together often sent them crashing on the rocks amidst roaring breakers. So Captain Cook's two sailing ships, the Resolution and the Discovery, went scudding to the south under bare poles, while the Storm King of the North blew the waves of the Pacific mountain high. Then, when the storm was over, the doughty captain unfurled his sails and let another breeze blow him north again. But squalls came, so tacking was necessary. Captain Cook had to stay far out at sea, lest the wind and tide should send him among the white-capped breakers he saw through his telescope on the Oregon shore. "Our ships complained," wrote one of the officers of the creaking, groaning ships, blown by high winds and waves. Stop and think of the date. It was 1778. Over on the North Atlantic coast, the American colonies were fighting the Revolutionary War with Great Britain. But of the North Pacific coast no one knew anything at all. It is true, a few Spanish explorers had been sent up this coast, but their reports were poor. Worse yet, they had not been printed, so the world knew little enough about the Spanish explorations on this coast. We know now, however, that one Spanish explorer was sure he saw a river mouth or a bay on that North Pacific coast. There were sandbars across the mouth of this bay, and the waves broke high over them. He did not dare to cross the bar. Still, he named it the Rio San Roque, that is, the river of St. Roque. Besides this rather uncertain river, it was thought that there was an inlet or strait somewhere along this coast. All that anyone knew was that some 200 years before, in 1592, an old Portuguese named Juan de Fuca had said that he had been in this part of the world, and that there was an inlet there which connected the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific. But no one else had ever seen it, and no one knows to this day whether Juan de Fuca really saw those straits or not. All nations were looking at this time for an inlet called the Straits of Anian, some water passage between the two great oceans which lie east and west of America. No such straits ever existed. Yet not many years ago an Arctic explorer found straits far north leading into the Arctic Ocean, so that a ship actually can go from the Atlantic to the Pacific now, if it goes by way of the icebergs and bitter cold of the Arctic Ocean. Now Captain Cook had been sent out to look for these straits, and also to look for a rumored River of the West, which the Indians said flowed toward the setting sun and emptied into the bitter waters. That was why he watched the shore so closely with his spyglass. All he could see of Oregon was that it was hilly, covered with trees, with low valleys between. But he could see no river. As he sailed farther north, he thought he saw a broad stretch of water leading toward the east. At first he flattered himself he had found those straits. Then he decided it was only a low, marshy land. But he was so disappointed that he called a projecting point of land Cape Flattery, and Cape Flattery it is today, on the southern shore of the Straits of San Juan de Fuca. On he sailed northward, this time with a breeze from the south, until he found himself at the entrance of a large sound. Just at sunset the ship sailed in. So far as Captain Cook knew, it had no name, so he called it King George's Sound, although it was later called Nootka Sound. Yet the Spanish had already seen it, and they had called it San Lorenzo. Nootka Sound was a beautiful place after weeks on the stormy ocean with those complaining ships. The sun was shining and the sky was blue. The water rippled softly on many little islands which were fresh and green in the early spring. On the shore were dense forests of tall straight trees which came down to the water's edge. The water was too deep to anchor. The sailors tied the ships to the trees with great hawsers. The Indians had been watching them, but paid little attention to them that evening, though many canoes paddled around them. The next day they welcomed the ship in great state. 3 canoes first came out. In the foremost were 10 men, in the second 6, and in the last were 2. All were dressed in long robes of sea otter skins, reaching from their necks to their knees. There were no sleeves, of course. The robes were only skins fastened together. Their faces and legs were painted with red and black, in stripes and squares. Their long black hair was bunched up in club fashion on the top of their heads, and mixed in with it were spruce twigs. The green leaves of the spruce showed through the black hair. Over all this, downy white feathers were strewed. An English boy, who was a prisoner among them some years later, tells us exactly how they dressed when visitors came. As these canoes neared the ship, a chief arose in the foremost one to make a speech. He had a rattle in his hand which he shook when he talked. He talked a long time, indeed, in a very loud voice, and strewed the water about him with downy white feathers. That was a ceremony of welcome. Other Indians in the 2 canoes behind him strewed the water with a reddish powder. By all this the Englishmen understood they were invited to come on shore. When the first chief became tired, another arose and talked in the same loud tone, still motioning the white men to the shore. These Indians were not in the least afraid of their white visitors. Then, after a while, the men began to sing one of their songs. It was a soft, pleasing melody, sung in perfect time, and they kept time to it by striking the canoes with their paddles. The English planned to stay in this pleasant harbor for a while. They needed fresh water and new masts. They needed also fresh meat, such as game and fish, and vegetables or greens of some kind. Besides this, the ships were going into the Alaskan waters, where it was bitterly cold. When they saw the Indians with many furs, they began to trade for them, for the men would need warm clothing and warm bedding, such as bearskin rugs. When Cook and his officers began to trade for furs, to their astonishment the Indians would not accept as payment the bells and beads and looking-glasses which the South Sea Islanders and the Hawaiians had taken. Nothing was accepted by these Nootka Sound Indians but metal. Like the Indians who burned the first white men's ship they saw for the metal in it, so these red men were eager for brass and copper and iron, and for a little metal they were willing to give many furs. You can guess what happened. The sailors sold the metal buttons off their coats. The brass handles were taken off their bureaus. Candlesticks, tin cans, copper kettles, small knives, bits of iron, everything that was metal on the ship was sold to the Indians for furs. And some things were not sold, for the Indians would steal many bits they could not buy. They cut the blocks out of the tackle. Even heavy iron pieces were cut from the ropes and tossed to a nearby canoe. They were clever thieves, the captain said. One Indian would talk to the sentinel on duty, while another, at a little distance, would pull the ironwork off and toss it overboard to some friend. But the Indians sold quantities of furs of all kinds: wolf, bear, fox, deer, marten, and many others, besides the beautiful sea otter skins and robes. The sailors bought more than they needed, because the Indians were so eager to sell, and they knew that at least they would be warm in the north. So when all repairs were made, new spars put in place, fresh water in all the water casks, fresh game and fish on board for a few days, the men rested by their stay on land, and all was ready, the 2 little ships sailed out of the harbor northward. After a long time in the north, exploring, they went over on the Asiatic side. There, at Kamchatka, they found Russian fur traders who wanted to buy their furs. As Captain Cook was going to China then, the men and sailors did not need the furs longer, and many were sold to the Russians. But the sailors did not know the value of these furs and did not ask high prices. Besides, there were no shops in which to spend the money, and they did not know what to do with it. Russian silver roubles seemed of so little value that these pieces of money were kicked about the decks like chips of wood. Then the ships sailed southward, and some time after reached China. Now the Chinese were just as anxious for those furs as the Indians of Nootka Sound had been for bits of metal. The sailors were amazed at the prices paid to them, and yet very few of the furs were perfect. Some had been used for blankets in their bunks, some were partly worn when they bought them from the natives, and others again had been worn on deck and were spotted with tar and grease. Yet the Chinese bought them. Now, when the sailors learned the high value of the furs, they were eager to return to Nootka Sound for more. They could make their fortunes so easily. They almost mutinied when the officers refused to allow them to go back. But this was a royal exploring expedition, not a fur-trading voyage. So back to London they went, arriving there in 1780. Captain Cook had been killed at the Sandwich Islands, but the journals of the expedition were published at once. Besides that, the sailors told everyone they met of the great wealth to be secured by trading with the Indians at Nootka Sound, how the Indians would sell furs for bits of metal, and the Chinese would pay high prices for the furs. That was the beginning of the fur trade along the North Pacific coast. Soon after these journals were published, ships began to go to Nootka Sound for furs. The first were English ships sailing from India and China. Captain Meares, of whom we will hear later, was an English trader from India. Immediately after, Yankee captains began to go from Boston and from other cities on the North Atlantic coast. The Revolutionary War was over, and the vessels were almost idle. Captain Robert Gray was one of these New England captains. Both he and Captain Meares had some interesting adventures, as the next few chapters will show. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Captain Meares at Nootka Sound. Launching of the Northwest America. On a bright May day in 1788, two little trading ships sailed into Nootka Sound. It was just 10 years after Captain Cook, with his two exploring ships, had entered this same sound. All the world by this time knew about this fur trade, and ships were beginning to go up the northwest coast of America on trading voyages. The larger of these two trading ships was commanded by Captain John Meares, though both were owned by his company and under his control. This was the captain's second voyage. His first had been up to Alaska, where he had been caught in the ice all winter, and with all his men had come near dying from the cold. But two other English captains had found him there and helped him out. On his way south in that first voyage, after getting out of the ice, Meares had stopped at Nootka Sound, and again at the Sandwich Islands, as the Hawaiian Islands were then called. At Nootka Sound he found a chief called Comacella, a brother of the great chief Maquina, who wanted to see the world. Meares took Comacella on board. At Oahu he found a Sandwich Island chief, Tiana, who also wanted to go sightseeing, so Meares took him also, and they sailed away for China. Now on this bright May day in 1788, Captain Meares was entering Nootka Sound on his second fur-trading voyage, and Comacella and Tiana were both on board. So were many Chinese carpenters. His crew were Lascars from the Asiatic coast. Meares had a curious shipload with him. They came to anchor in that same friendly cove in the Sound where Captain Cook had found shelter 10 years before. Maquina, the chief, came to welcome him with all his people. Captain Meares went on shore. He said Comacella would shortly land, so the Indians all stood about to see this much-travelled chief. When he did step off shipboard, he was a wonderfully dressed Indian. His tribesmen gasped with astonishment. Comacella wore a red military coat, with many brass buttons on it. On his head was a turned-back military hat, with a big bright cockade on it. His shirt was linen, and his trousers of dark cloth. But the most wonderful thing was this: many scraps of bright copper, gleaming like gold, pieces which he had begged and stolen, were fastened all over that bright red coat. A half sheet of shining copper formed a breastplate. Copper ornaments hung from his ears. His hair was long and black and braided. Fastened to this long black queue were so many copper handles from saucepans and frying pans that he could not bend his head. By their weight and stiffness they bent his head back until his neck ached, and he was most laughable to look at. Last of all, he had taken out of the cook's galley, after a real fight with the cook, a great steel meat spit, a spit on which the cook roasted his meats before the open fire. Oh, Kamelika was a wonderfully dressed chief. The Indians thought him gorgeous. But who shall say what the cook thought when he looked at the pile of saucepans and frying pans with the handles all broken squarely off, or when he wanted to roast his meats? Tiana was also finely dressed, but he was only a Sandwich Islander, and these Nootka Indians did not care anything about him. Captain Meares began to build a house after Chief McKenna said he might, so the Chinese carpenters, with their funny blue blouses and their long black queues, clambered down off the ship and landed on the island. What Meares really wanted was a trading post, where his men could live and buy furs from the Indians. But as a fur-trading fort it was very different from those which the great fur companies built in after years. Captain Meares' house had 2 stories. On the ground floor were to be stored the furs, the rope and sails and ship's stores, besides the food supplies. In the second story were sleeping rooms for the men and for the officers, and also a large dining room. Then a low barricade of brushwood and logs was put around the house, so that Indians could not surprise it too easily. But of course, if they had wanted to fight, the fort would not have stood long. After the house was finished, the Chinese carpenters were put to work building a small ship, of 40 or 50 tons. This was to be a coaster, to run into and out of little harbors and creeks along the coast, and buy furs at the Indian villages. While they were building this, Captain Meares sent the smaller of his 2 sailing ships north to explore and buy furs, while he went south in the larger one to do the same thing. Chief McKenna said he would take care of the carpenters and the few white men left behind. Coasting slowly southward on a pleasant June day in 1788, Captain Meares came to the entrance of a great inlet. It stretched far to the eastward, and one could not see land at the other end. It had been seen the year before by Captain Barclay, who named it, told other captains about it, and wrote about it in his logbook. Captain Barclay thought it might be the Straits of Juan de Fuca. He also called this broad inlet by that name. Both captains thought this inlet must lead either straight across to the Atlantic Ocean, or else connect with rivers that emptied into that ocean. Look at the map and see if it does this. This was the very same inlet which Captain Cook had looked for, but could not see. He thought it low marshy ground. The breeze blew Captain Meares slowly southward, until, near Cape Flattery, he came to a rocky island. Canoes soon were all around them, filled with savage-looking redskins. The faces of these men were grim enough, but red and black ochre and whale oil made them grimmer yet. Their large canoes held from 20 to 30 men, and each warrior was armed with bow and arrows, the arrows tipped with bits of ragged bone. Their large spears were also tipped with knife-like edges of mussel shell. Yet these savage, red-painted, oily Indians wore superb robes of beautiful sea otter skins, which they refused at all times to sell. The chief's name was Tatoosh, and his name was given to this rocky island. He came on board, a surly-looking fellow, not at all like the handsome, dignified Indian chiefs of many of the land tribes. Meares made gifts to him. The surly Tatoosh did not even thank the Englishman, let alone returning gift for gift, as was the Indian custom. More than that, he would not allow any of his people to sell furs to the traders. The captain looked about him. It was a wild scene. This little island was crowded and swarming with Indians, yet aside from fishing there could be no way of getting food. Even roots would not grow on these barren rocks. The surf beat on the rocky shores of the straits, both north and south. Above the dense black forest, which came down almost to the water's edge, rose the snowy ridge of the Olympic Mountains. Captain Meares sent the longboat to find an anchoring place, as he wanted to trade for sea otter robes. But at once war canoes gathered around the longboat, while Indians tried to jump into it and steal the small trading articles lying there. They jeered at the sailors, who were so enraged they wanted to fight. But the officer kept them quiet, else perhaps not a man on either the ship or in the longboat might have escaped. The boat was recalled immediately. But now the breeze had died down. Meares spread his sails and hoped to go farther south, but the sails hung lifeless. The next morning the ship was not 400 feet from where it had been the night before. Tatoosh and his warriors, 400 strong, came out in their war canoes and paddled around and around the ship. They seemed to admire it very much, but the captain took pains not to invite any of them on board. Then the Indians began to sing. It was a simple little melody, yet sung in exact time, and with so many voices in the open air, it was very sweet. It almost made the Englishmen homesick. At noon the breeze sprang up. The captain sailed southward. He tried to enter Shoalwater Bay, but the water was too shallow on the bar. Then he sailed on, until he came to what seemed to be an opening in the coast, like a river. He saw what might be a bay, or perhaps a river mouth. The bay was shut off from the ocean by long sandbars. Tremendous waves thundered over the bar. The great whitecaps were dangerous to any sailing ship. Captain Meares steered in toward this bay, but the water began to grow shallow. 9 fathoms, called the men with the sounding leads. 8 fathoms, they called. Still it grew shallower. 7 fathoms, they shouted, and the breakers were right ahead. Captain Meares steered out. He was so disappointed that he called a high cape on the north side of the bay Cape Disappointment. The bay he called Deception Bay, because he had been deceived, so he thought, into believing it might be a river mouth. Then he said in his logbook, without the slightest respect for English grammar, "We can now with safety assert that there is no such river as that of St. Roch exists, as laid down in the Spanish charts." Then the ungrammatical captain turned around and sailed back to Nootka Sound. This happened 4 years before Captain Robert Gray, from Boston, daringly sailed into that bay and found it was the mouth of the Columbia River. But the name Cape Disappointment sticks to that headland even today. When Captain Meares reached Nootka Sound again, he was much pleased to find the new little coasting vessel, the Northwest America, almost ready for launching. Everything was all right. The Indians had been friendly. They had even made a trail through the rough forest, because the trees which the Chinese carpenters needed for building that little ship were back in the woods. The trees nearby were too large. But in the Sound also were Americans, just out from Boston. Captain Robert Gray, in the Lady Washington, was there when Meares arrived, and shortly after Captain John Kendrick of the Columbia sailed in. And these Americans were much surprised to find, on that wild, lonely shore, Chinese carpenters hard at work building a ship, while a house flying the British flag stood on the shore. At last, late in September that same year, 1788, the Northwest America was ready for launching. The British flag was hoisted, and the tide was at just the right height. Maquina and Comacella, with all their wild tribesmen, had come from their winter houses back in the forest. Tiana, the Sandwich Island chief, was on board the new ship. Hawaiians live in the water like ducks, and Tiana thought this was good fun. A gun was fired. The carpenters knocked down the props, and like a shot the little ship started from the ways. She slipped into the water with such speed, and dashed across the harbor so wildly, that she ran halfway out toward the open ocean. Nobody there knew much about launching a ship. Captain Meares said he did not, and no one would expect it of Chinese carpenters. So they entirely forgot to put a cable and anchor on her. But she had no sails yet, so small boats went out and towed her back to the dock. Tiana, on board, was much pleased. He capered about on deck as she dashed across the little cove, clapping his hands gleefully and shouting, "Mighty! Mighty!" And so was launched the first ship built on the northwest coast of America. The country had no other name yet, and it was a curious scene. It was a fur trading ship, built by Chinese carpenters for an English captain, who, with his Lascar crew, often sailed under the Portuguese flag. It was built on a wild, lonely shore, uninhabited by white people, and launched under the surprised eyes of Yankees just out from Boston, and of Nootka Sound chiefs, with all their red-painted followers. And it had on board, as it dashed into the water, a Sandwich Island chief who was fond of travel and wanted to see the world. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Barry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4: The Battle in the Straits of San Juan de Fuca. Captain Barclay was the first man to see the Straits of San Juan de Fuca, so far as we know, and Barclay named them, since he knew of that old Portuguese sailor who claimed to have seen such straits on the western coast of America. Captain Meares claimed that he himself named them, but this is incorrect. But just before going north to launch the Northwest America, that late summer of 1788, Captain Meares sailed his ship into a harbor just north of the Straits, and sent the longboat with one officer and 13 men to explore the inlet. Did it lead to the Atlantic Ocean? How far away was the Atlantic Ocean from the point where they were? Or did this inlet lead to Hudson Bay, or to some river which emptied into the Atlantic Ocean? No one knew. But everyone, fur trader or explorer, who saw a new bit of the country, claimed it in the name of his own nation. When Meares sent his longboat into the Straits that July, therefore, he wrote to the officer, "You will take possession of this strait and the lands adjoining in the name of the King and Crown of Great Britain." He wrote this, instead of saying it, because he wanted it on record. The longboat party sailed and partly rowed the short distance back to the Straits. There was Tatoosh, the rocky island again, swarming with Indians and crowded with the rough huts of the redskins; and the shores all around the entrance of the Straits were dotted with these same small, rough board houses. Paying no attention to the Indians, the men rowed into the inlet, just how far we do not know, but up along the northern shore. The Indians at first paid little attention to them, but as they sailed farther in, things became more dangerous. One morning, as they were near the shore, the Indians began to show fight. 2 canoes, with perhaps 50 warriors in all, came directly up to the longboat. They intended to capture it and make the sailors slaves. Other canoes stood at a little distance, to help if they could. The shore was thronged with men, women, and children, most of them armed with slings and stones. And so began the battle. The canoe warriors, armed with bone-tipped arrows and shell-tipped spears, began the attack. They tried to jump into the longboat and throw the sailors overboard, but they were forced back. Then the canoes drew back, while from the shore and the canoes flew showers of arrows into the boat and among the men. One Indian lifted a long spear to hurl it at the boatswain not far from him. As he was about to throw it, the officer in command drew his pistol and shot the Indian. Then the canoes all drew off a little, while another shower of arrows came among the sailors. At last, after sharp fighting, the longboat gradually got out of reach of the slings and arrows from the shore, and made its way down to the entrance of the Straits again, past Tatoosh Island, out into the ocean, and northward to the waiting ship. Captain Meares was waiting anxiously for the boat. When it came into the harbor where he was, he counted the crew. All were there. But as the boat came nearer, he saw some were badly wounded, and the boat damaged by arrows and stones. Yet none of the men were killed. One thing in particular had saved the sailors. Over the back of the longboat they had dropped the awning, which, if drawn up, partly covered the boat. Sailors spend whole weeks in such boats, eating and sleeping there, hot, sunny days and cold, rainy nights, so they needed such an awning. Into this loose canvas many arrows had stuck. The awning also broke the force of the stones thrown by the people on shore with their slings. Another thing which had helped was that by the motion of the waves both the canoes of the Indians and the longboat of the sailors were in constant motion, so that their aim was poor. So ended this battle of the Straits. In later years, however, after American settlers had come into Oregon country and many had built houses in the little villages around Puget Sound, a small armed American ship was surrounded by the canoes of these Indians and captured. The Indians not only captured the ship, but destroyed it. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, When Captain Gray Crossed the Terrible Bar. Out from Boston Harbor in September 1790 went a little sailing ship laden with many things, bound for the northwest coast of America. On board was a cargo of coffee, tea, chocolate, sugar, flour, salt beef, salt pork, butter, cheese, molasses, and 27,000 pounds of hard, dry ship's bread. Besides food, Captain Gray had also on board sea coal, bars of iron and bars of lead, gunpowder, shot, guns, Indian trading goods, tar and pitch, and 2,000 bricks. There were 30 men in the crew, and the vessel was armed with 10 large ship's guns. These were for defense against pirates and Indians. This was the second voyage of Captain Robert Gray to Nootka Sound. The first time, 2 years before this, was when he stood with his crew and watched in amazement the launching of Captain Meares's coasting vessel, the Northwest America. Gray and Kendrick, who were sent out by the same firm of shipowners and fur traders, had exchanged vessels that fall. Kendrick now had the smaller ship, the Lady Washington, while Gray had the larger, the Columbia. Captain Gray, in the Columbia, had taken the furs of that first voyage over to China, sold them there, bought tea, and had taken that around the Horn to Boston. Now he was off for his second voyage, with iron and lead and bricks in his hold. The lead was for bullets. The iron was for trading after the blacksmith had made it into small articles, such as fishhooks, armlets and bracelets, chisels, and many other things. But can you imagine why he took bricks? Fancy carrying 2,000 bricks from Boston, down the eastern side of both North and South America, then around the dangerous Horn, and all the way up the western side of the two Americas again. 2,000 bricks are just enough to build a chimney. Captain Gray intended to build a small fort, similar to Captain Meares's, because he was intending to remain on the coast that next winter. He did build a log cabin at Clayoquot Sound, and spent the winter there. Now, when Captain Gray, just out from Boston on his second voyage, reached Oregon, he began trading up and down the coast, running into little inlets and harbors and bays wherever he saw an Indian village. Like all other captains, he was always on the lookout for a friendly sail in these lonely waters. One morning, just at dawn, in the spring of 1792, he was hailed by a British exploring vessel. It was under the command of Captain George Vancouver, who had with him a smaller ship as a tender. Vancouver invited Gray to visit him, so the Yankee went aboard the British vessel for a friendly chat. They sailed into the Straits in a thick, misting rain, and while the captains and officers talked of possible rivers and bays and islands, the crews fished in vain from the wet, slippery decks for a mess of fish. Vancouver wanted to know whether Nootka Sound was on an island. He talked also about a mysterious River of the West, which was supposed to be near there. Gray said that a few days before, near 46°, he had stopped at a large bay, which he thought must be the mouth of a large river. The ocean water near by was discolored with mud, and that was a proof. But Vancouver had also passed that bay a few days before. He said the muddy water might come from some small river near by, but there was no large river there. Now, this bay, or was it a river, near 46°, was the very one which had puzzled so many other people. The Spanish explorer had said it was a river, and named it the Rio San Roque. Captain Cook saw nothing at all. Captain Meares thought it was a river, tried to sail into it, was afraid of the breakers, and sailed away, saying it was a bay of the ocean. Captain Gray thought it must be the mouth of a large river. Captain Vancouver was sure it was only a salt-water bay. Now, Gray was a Yankee, and rather an independent man. If that really was a river, he wanted to know it, and there must be many furs in it. So when his ship sailed out of the Straits of San Juan de Fuca, after his visit with Vancouver was over, he went straight south to that bay. Back Gray went. He had waited there before, trying to get in. Now he waited again. Indeed, he waited for several days, because the wind was blowing and the waves were high. Gray's plan was daring. 7 miles long were those sandbars, outside the river mouth, and 3 miles wide, with only a narrow, winding channel between them, as he found afterwards. All the mouth of the river was choked with these sandbars, far outside of Cape Disappointment. The rushing water from the river met the waves thrown upon the bar by wind and tide, and the breakers were terrific. Roaring and thundering, day after day, the white waves crashed and beat over the bars. In the quiet of the forested hills, the uproar of the waters could be heard for miles. It was certain death to anyone caught in those white, foaming breakers. Then, one day, May 11, 1792, the wind quieted down, the waves were a little calmer, and though the breakers still dashed and thundered, Gray thought he could see a channel. In went the little sailing ship, depending only upon the breeze and the skill of the captain, in through that narrow, winding, unknown channel into the unknown bay. Carefully Gray steered while his men sounded the depth of water, until at last they were through the breakers and inside. Then the sailors found at once, as they dipped up the water, that it was sweet, fresh river water, and not salt water. Had it been merely a bay, the water would have been salt. Captain Robert Gray had discovered the River of the West, which Indians many years before had said flowed into the Bitter Waters. Indians in their canoes now came out over the broad, gleaming river, dancing blue in the sunshine, as Captain Gray sailed up the river for 15 miles or so. At last he anchored, and then they had a busy time. The Indians were trading furs and fish and roots, the armorer was hammering at his forge, working up those iron bars, carpenters were making repairs, painters were painting and caulking the ship, some of the sailors were washing down the ship, and others were refilling the water casks with fresh water. On a Tuesday, 4 days after they entered, Captain Gray and his mate "went on shore to take a short view of the country," so the old logbook says. They did more. They took possession of the country in the name of the United States of America. That really did not amount to much, because Gray was only a private fur trader, and no official report was ever made by him to the government, so far as we know. Gray hoisted on the Columbia River the American flag, and planted there on the shore some New England pine tree shillings under a tree, and named the river after his plucky little ship. They named the 2 capes also. One was to be Cape Hancock, and the other Cape Adams, after 2 famous New England men. But the old name, Cape Disappointment, was the one which, after all, stuck to the northern headland. Pine tree shillings were just the thing to plant in the Oregon country. There were a few pines along the Columbia River, though not many, but all the hills which rolled back from this broad, glorious stream were black with dense forests of other cone-bearing trees, spruce and fir and hemlock. Another interesting thing is that this river on the western coast was discovered just 300 years after Columbus discovered America, 1492 and 1792. And that the United States was only 9 years old when the American flag was hoisted in the river and on the shore. Captain Gray stayed in the river some 10 days, trading with the swarms of Indians who came out to his ship, and getting a fresh start. The old logbook told just which days were bright and sunny and which were cloudy or rainy. But the old log does not tell us half as much as we want to know about the wonderful crossing of that terrible bar, and of the stay in the river. Gray's daring in facing those breakers and entering the river gave the United States the very first right she had to claim any part of the Oregon country. Before that, Spain and Great Britain were the only ones having any real right to it. The crossing of that fearsome bar was a daring thing to do, with only a sailing vessel, tossed this way and that by the wind or the currents, to face those terrific breakers which roared and dashed and thundered at the entrance of the Columbia. In 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition came overland from St. Louis, and they discovered and explored part of the river from the other direction. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6 The Adventures of Lewis and Clark. 13 years after Captain Gray entered the Columbia River, a party of 32 men and 1 woman, nearly all Americans, were coming up the Missouri River on an exploring expedition. Captain Meriwether Lewis and Captain William Clark were the 2 leaders, and nearly all their men were American soldiers. All were white except 3. One of these was a slender little Indian woman of 18 or 19, with her tiny papoose strapped on her back. A second was her husband, the guide, who was half Indian and half French. The third was a black negro. Up the Missouri River in 1805 came this party in the bright spring sunshine. The wide plains on each side were green with grass and black with buffaloes. Wild flowers were blooming, birds singing, the sky was blue overhead, and the green trees bordering the river waved their long branches in the fresh prairie breeze. Sometimes, it is true, the weather was stormy and rainy, yet much of the time it was beautiful. One thing these men were to do was to cross, and explore as they crossed, the new Louisiana Purchase, a vast stretch of country westward from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Its northern border was then undecided. Another thing was to cross the mountains and valleys and go through the Oregon country to the Pacific Ocean. Oregon in those days was that unknown stretch of mountains and valleys beyond the Rocky Mountains and north of California. It extended as far north as Russian America, which is now Alaska. So it was 1,000 miles wide, east and west, along its southern border. It was not so wide at the north because the Rocky Mountains trend northwestward, and the Oregon boundary followed the mountains. Along the seacoast it was about 800 miles long. No one had explored Oregon at all, except a few British fur traders in the north. In the southern part, Captain Gray had discovered the mouth of the Columbia River. Up and down the coast, British and American fur trading ships, like Captain Meares and Gray's and Kendrick's, had sailed, and they had found that Nootka Sound was on an island, but that was about all that anybody knew about it at that time. So Lewis and Clark were to explore the southern part of Old Oregon along the Columbia River. Day after day, that pleasant spring of 1805, they followed the windings of the muddy Missouri. Sometimes at night they camped upon an island in midstream, feeling safer there from the Indians. Sometimes they camped on shore. There were many dangers, from drowning, from Indians, and from other causes. But they had, on the Missouri River, abundance of food. Herds of deer, as well as black throngs of buffaloes, grazed on the broad, grassy plains around them. Wild geese and ducks floated on the river, or whirred over it when frightened. As the river narrowed, in what is now Montana, they watched for a great waterfall, because the Indians told them this fall was on the true Missouri, and they were afraid of getting into some branch of the river. Walking along the bank one morning, Captain Clark heard a distant roar like thunder. Then he saw a cloud of mist blow over the plains. Hurrying happily to it, he found that it was indeed the roar of falling waters and misty spray driven by a June breeze. Very much excited, he sat down on a rock near by and waited for the boats with his men and Captain Lewis to come up. He He named the place the Great Falls of the Missouri, and the city which stands near there today is named Great Falls. But now the troubles of the explorers began. The June sunshine was glorious, with fresh breezes from the mountains, the grass was green, and the wild flowers beautiful. Buffaloes were plentiful around them also, so that there was no lack of food. Yet their troubles for the next 20 miles were endless. First, on account of the falls, which thundered down the river in cascades and in falls for nearly 18 miles, they had to go overland. Boats, Indian trading goods, their written reports, their surveying instruments, everything had to be carried for 20 miles to smooth water. They needed a rough wagon, but a wagon must have wheels. After whole days of search, they found the only tree within 20 miles of them that was large enough. They were in a treeless country. They cut down that tree, sawed off round pieces, bored a hole in the center of these slabs, and behold, there were the wheels. But such clumsy wheels! Then cross pieces held the whole together, and the canoes were loaded on. The men harnessed themselves to drag it all. Can you imagine the hardships? Up hills they went, and down ravines, and across gullies. The soft wood of the cross pieces and the whiffletree broke constantly. Worse than that, the ground was covered with prickly pear cactus, and the hooked thorns cut through their moccasins. Their shoes had long since been worn out. Besides all this, the ground was the kind known as gumbo. It was soft and sticky during rains. Buffaloes had tramped over it while it was wet and soft, and had cut up the earth with their sharp hoofs into sharp, fine points. In the sunshine, this ground dried as hard as a rock, and sharp points cut like pins and needles. Nor was that all. They had a terrific hailstorm in traveling that short distance. The hailstones were large enough to knock some of the men down. Everyone was bruised by them. Yet actually their worst enemy was the grizzly bear. Grizzlies were always savage, but these bears were so used to attacking large animals, such as elk and buffalo, that they were not in the least afraid of men. And they were very strong. Even after they had been shot again and again, when wounded with 6 or 8 bullets, they would run after the hunters. With blazing eyes, open mouth, and roaring loudly, they would rush after them with great speed and with outspread claws. The talons on some of these bears were 4½ inches long. Again and again the hunters of the expedition escaped only with their lives, jumping down high bluffs, with the bear tumbling heavily after them. Those 20 miles of cacti, gumbo soil, hailstorms, grizzly bears, blazing hot sunshine, steep hills and ravines, and their heavy, clumsy homemade wagon with its round wooden wheels fairly wore the men out. 2 weeks they spent in this way. But after that trying 2 weeks, the explorers put their canoes into the water again and paddled up the river. At last the water became so shallow, and there were so many rapids, they hid the canoes and started off on foot. They also cached all the Indian goods and the powder and lead which they could not take with them. A cache, as the word was used in those old days, was a hiding place, dug carefully in the earth. The hole was lined with small branches of trees and underbrush to keep the goods from the dampness, sometimes lined also with buffalo robes. Then the goods were put in, covered with other robes, other branches, and earth thrown over the top. Everything was done as carefully as possible, so as not to show that a cache had been made. Day after day they followed the little stream, for the Missouri River was only a creek now. One morning Sacagawea, the Bird Woman, pointed out the place where she had been taken prisoner by the Blackfeet about 6 years before. Now, with the Americans, and with her tiny baby on her back, she was returning to her girlhood home. The explorers were going directly toward the Three Forks of the Missouri, a point where 3 streams, meeting, formed the upper waters of the Missouri. They were on dangerous ground. Because this was a country famous for its hunting, it was also a famous battleground. From the north came the terrible Blackfeet. From the south the Shoshones, or Snakes, the tribe of Sacagawea. From the east the Crows, famous for their expert thievery and their long hair.
From the west, the Flatheads, always friendly to the white men, and the Nez Perces. The Nez Perces came over the mountains of the Bitter Root and through the valleys of the Rocky Mountains on hunting expeditions. Lewis and Clark now wanted to meet friendly Indians. They needed to know how to cross the Stony Mountains, which loomed up before them. They needed also to buy horses. They did everything to show friendliness, in case Indians should be watching them unknown. The fact that they had a woman and her baby with them showed that they were not a war party, so the Bird Woman was near the leaders of the party. At last, Captain Lewis, trudging along with 2 men, saw on a hilltop an Indian warrior, some women, and a dog. Taking his blanket from his back, he threw it over his head and brought it unfolded to the ground. The action meant spreading a seat for a guest on the ground. It was a sign of friendship. The Indian advanced, and so did Lewis, until they were within 300 feet of each other. Then the redskin became frightened, turned his horse, and fled. Still Captain Lewis followed the trail that day and the next. Captain Clark had taken another trail, and Sacagawea was with him. Lewis met another Indian, and in about the same way. He also fled. As Lewis and his 2 men plodded on, they suddenly encountered 3 Indian women, who had been left behind by the fleeing warrior. One of these, a young girl, ran away. The other 2 bent their heads, expecting to be killed. Lewis rolled up his sleeves to show his white skin. He kept repeating also the Shoshone word for white man. He gave some beads to the women, and made them call back the young woman who had run away. He painted the faces of all 3 with red paint, and then down on them, with hot haste, came an Indian war party of 60 warriors. The warriors were ready to fight, but when the women laughed and showed their presents and their newly painted faces, they at once became friendly. Captain Lewis made some presents to the chiefs and leading men, and went on with them to their camp. A few days later, Lewis and his men, joined by these Indians, returned to meet Captain Clark and the rest of the American party. The leading chief wished to talk with Lewis and Clark, but they had to have an interpreter. They sent for Sacagawea. When she came, she suddenly recognized that chief as her own brother. After this, the Indians were very friendly indeed. They sold horses, gave the explorers food, which they really needed themselves, and showed them how to cross the mountains and which was the best trail. Soon, therefore, after meeting with these friendly Shoshones, the explorers started over the trail to the westward. We call these mountains now the Rocky Mountains, but Lewis and Clark called them, as did the traders and trappers and hunters for years afterwards, the Stony Mountains, the Rock Mountains, the Snowy Mountains, and also the Shining Mountains, because when the sun shone on the snowy ridges, they gleamed brightly. All along the route the Indians had been friendly. This was because this party had been friendly to them, had given them presents, been kind to them, and had taken advantage of them in no way. So also the Flathead Indians, who lived in the Flathead Valley and on the slopes of the Bitter Root Mountains and in the Bitter Root Valley, were friendly. The Flatheads sold the Americans food, showed them the best trail over the Bitter Root Mountains, and were kind to them. The Bitter Root Mountains were so called because of the bitter little root with pink flowers which grew all over those mountains. The explorers called them Savage Mountains because they had such a fearful time crossing them, on the trail or off it. The mountain sides were very steep. They were densely forested, and even the trail was constantly blocked by fallen trees, lying one upon another. The streams ran in deep gorges, thundering and foaming far beneath them, and there were no bridges. The mountain torrents, racing down the mountain sides in spring and summer, were lower now, and some of them dried up. They could not always find fresh water. In climbing up and down the steep mountain sides, horses fell down with their loads, sometimes lost their footing and toppled over, down the mountain side or into a gorge. Winding among the rocky knobs on the higher levels, they lost their trail. It was now September, and the snow in the mountains was 1.5 feet deep. There was no game, and the dried buffalo meat brought with them was almost gone. Weary and worn and nearly starved, with some horses left behind them, dying with starvation and too weak to travel farther, the explorers at last reached the other side of the mountains and the lower levels. Here they saw 3 Indian boys at play, for it was summer in that country, though winter on the heights above. They offered ribbons to the boys if they would go to the village and tell their tribe that white men were starving and needed their help. In this way the Americans met the friendly Nez Perces. In this way they secured help and food and fresh horses to carry their baggage. In payment for the horses they gave the Indians scarlet leggings, handkerchiefs, tobacco, knives, and other things. They gave a chief a laced red coat. In the evenings, among these friendly red people, they took out their fiddles and played and danced, while the Indians laughed, just as all the Indians on the plains and on the Missouri River had laughed when the white men fiddled to them. Then they journeyed on. They traveled down the Clearwater to the Snake River and then on to the Columbia. When they understood that they at last had reached that River of the West which flowed into the Bitter Waters, they began to build canoes. Travel by water is much quicker and easier than by land in a new country. When ready to go down by boat, they gave their horses to the care of a friendly chief and paddled away. The Columbia itself was smooth enough, yet the voyage had its hardships. At Celilo Falls, again at the Dalles, and again at the Cascade Rapids, they had to carry their boats and all their baggage, and the tribes here were not so friendly as the Shoshones and Flatheads and Nez Perces had been. They were more degraded, living idle lives, depending on fish and on the trading which passed through their hands. The Indians above traded buffalo meat, dried or jerked, and pemmican with the Indians of the lower river for dried fish. Thus the horse Indians traded with the canoe Indians, and the 2 classes were very different. There is much more about them in other chapters. But these Indians at the portages were robber Indians, stealing from every boatload and demanding toll from every person who passed up or down the Columbia. From the time they set their canoes afloat upon the Columbia, the explorers visited every Indian village they saw, crossing the river constantly, making presents at each place, and telling the Indians they were friends. So they traveled on through October. From the Cascades down to the Willamette there was only the broad, smooth river, dotted here and there on its banks with villages, and the river was glorious in the sunlight, the sun shining on the high hills, forest-covered, on each side. Snowy peaks gleamed here and there. But on the lower river the winter rains had begun, for it was November. On they went, rain or shine, until one day they saw the breakers dashing furiously over the bar at the mouth of the Columbia, and heard the thunder of the crashing white waters. They had reached the end of their journey. Beyond lay the Pacific Ocean. But it was November. It rained and rained and rained. All day and all night the cold rain came down, while high winds blew high waves upon the mighty river and penned the men up for 3 or 4 days at a time upon some narrow point of land. At Point Ellice they had to encamp on a narrow shelf. Above them rose sheer rocks which they could not climb. But the rain-loosened rocks could and did fall down upon them. They could not escape by following the bank of the river, for rocks rose sheer out of the water on either side of them. The waves were too high to venture into the river with their small canoes. Their Indian goods and baggage they had placed above the tide, but the rain soaked them through and ruined part of them. Their canoes were fastened almost at their feet, but the high waves and the tides carried great driftwood logs among the boats, so that the men had constantly to push away the logs that the canoes might not be crushed. Such an accident would have been fatal. And there Lewis and Clark and their men stayed for days, without a tent or even an umbrella, in that cold, cheerless rain. Dressed only in leather, the chilling winds and rain almost froze them. At last, one day, there came a break in the storm, and in quieter waters they packed their baggage into their canoes and paddled away. Crossing to the south side of the river, they at last decided to build their winter fort on what is now Lewis and Clark River, a stream flowing into the Columbia. There they built 7 log cabins, afterwards protected by a high, spiked log wall, a palisade, to keep out Indian thieves or Indian enemies. Though many elk were in the forests around them, the explorers were half starved that winter. The hunters killed game, but before they could get it through the tangled forest to the fort, it would spoil. The winters there are not cold. Only the chill of the rain and winds is hard for people living in the open air, as these men did. They could not explore in the constant rain and fog, so they had to wait for the spring to come. Exploring, of course, was their only reason for being in the Oregon country at all. They were ordered to find out everything they could about it. By this time their supply of salt had given out. Down on the ocean, near what is now the village of Seaside, they made salt by boiling down salt sea water. In the spring they had to return to the United States. Their trading goods were almost gone, and they were not certain whether they had enough to buy the friendship of the tribes as they returned. But there was no time for exploring the Oregon country or going up and down the coast, even on land. It was a long homeward trail up the Columbia River in their canoes, back to the friendly chief who had taken good care of their horses, paying everywhere for fish and game and roots with their beads and paint and knives and ribbons and blankets, and here and there a scarlet laced coat. On they went, over those savage Bitter Root Mountains again, then over the Rockies, down the Missouri River, through the Great Plains. The homeward trail was very long indeed, but all the way back the Indians were friendly and kindly and helpful, because the explorers had been so to them on their way out. Indians have a keen sense of justice, and the white men are to blame for many of our Indian troubles. Because of that long journey, the United States was able to claim, by reason of exploration, the country through which the explorers had traveled. Gray had discovered the mouth of the Columbia River 13 years before. Now Lewis and Clark had discovered and journeyed down part of the upper river, but not all of it, and therefore part of the Columbia is in British Columbia, because the British discovered and explored the sources of it. Of all the people on that long voyage, which one do you think was the most interesting? To the Indians, York, the negro, was. He was very strong, and he was so very black. They used to rub their hands over his face and his arms to see if he was painted black. His flat nose and his woolly, kinky hair were a great puzzle to them. In after years these Indians told their children about this very black man who had come with the white men into the land of the red men. To many people, Sacagawea, the Bird Woman, is most interesting. She was a brave, patient little woman, starting off on that long journey with her precious baby on her back, but her keen eyes ever alert to help the kindly white men. She was a better guide than her husband, who was really the guide of the party. She could interpret where others could not. Indians who feared the white men with their strange beards and clothing, and their guns shooting lightning and making thunder, lost their fear when they saw this slender little woman among them. She made dozens of pairs of moccasins for the explorers. When they were hungry and starving, she starved too. She walked just as far and over as many prickly pears and as many rocks as they did. At one time on the Missouri River, when her clumsy husband upset the canoe in which the papers and reports were, together with the instruments for measuring the mountains, she came to the rescue. She held her baby firmly in one hand and reached out with the other and steadied the canoe, and picked the papers off the water as they floated by. Without these papers and the steadying of the canoe, which saved the measuring instruments, the explorers could not have gone farther. They would have had to return. So the brave little Bird Woman saved the expedition. Fur traders followed the explorers the very year after. Missionaries and settlers followed the fur traders and trappers, and so, within 40 years, there were many Americans living in the Oregon country, along the Columbia River and down the Willamette River. That meant the settlement of the whole country and the great cities which are now planted there, where the Indians pitched their teepees. End of Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, How They Built Astoria. Outside the terrible bar of the Columbia tossed a little sailing ship one gray March day in 1811. This was just 5 years after Lewis and Clark had left the mouth of the Columbia and had gone back across the plains and the mountains to St. Louis. This ship was the Tonquin. On board were the partners and clerks of the fur company. She was waiting for a fair wind to carry her through the channel amidst the breakers on the bar. The men on that ship looked in dismay at the scene around them. Directly in front of them, for miles, dashed and thundered and pounded the white waves on the bar, because the wind was strong. Once in among those breakers, the little sailing vessel would be carried this way and that, perhaps pounding upon a bar with great white cumbers crashing over her, and go down, as many a ship has done since. And this was the very place, of course, where Captain Robert Gray, nearly 20 years before, had sailed over that famous bar. Beyond the bar was a great open bay, where the water was less rough. At last the ship lowered a small boat with 4 men in it, and sent it in to find the channel. Both crew and passengers on the Tonquin watched it anxiously. The small boat went in toward the channel, was caught in the waves, struggled a while, and then went down. No one ever again saw that boat or any man that was in it. The next day another boat was lowered with 4 men, because that channel had to be found. That, too, was caught by the breakers and went down. Only one of the men was saved. He was washed ashore and found later, nearly dead. What were they to do? The passengers on the Tonquin were fur traders, and they had come to build a fur trading post at the mouth of the Columbia. They had to get into that river. At last, at a favorable turn of the tide, when the wind had died down a little and the breeze came from the right direction, Captain Jonathan Thorne tried to sail in through what seemed to be the channel. And though it was night, yet somehow, they never knew just how, the ship slipped through that narrow, winding channel among the sandbars and drifted into Baker's Bay. The next morning the very first thing they did was to go ashore and build a pig pen. The Tonquin was crowded, not only with people, including Kanakas, whom they had engaged at the Sandwich Islands, but also with pigs and cows which they had bought there. There was little room for anybody. The animals had to be landed, and they were, in a very short time, so that the crowded ship was more comfortable. The next step was to find a site for the fort. All about them, on both sides of the river, the dense black forests came down to the water's edge. The banks of the river were quite steep. For a fort they needed to have, close at hand, logs of the right size for cabins. They needed the river for their ships. Spring water or else river water nearby for drinking, as well as for washing and cooking. They needed space for a garden and for their livestock, and they needed also a fairly level space on which to erect their cabins, which they would have to fence in. None of the places near the ship seemed to be suitable. The partners went up the river and down and over to the south side, while Captain Thorne scolded about smoking and picnic parties. The stern captain insisted they must find a place quickly, or else he would land the trading goods and everything else and sail away to trade for furs along the coast north of them. So they hurried to find a good spot nearby. 2 of the partners went up the river from Baker's Bay, where the ship was anchored, promising to be back on a certain day. They met an old one-eyed chief named Comcomly, a funny old fellow, who was very friendly to them. After talking to him, by signs, and spending several days searching along the shore for a good site, they started back to the ship. The wind had risen and the water was rough. Comcomly warned them not to go, but the partners had promised, and they were rather afraid of Captain Thorne, so back they started. The waves were high, the river was covered with whitecaps. They had gone only a mile when up dashed a big wave, and down went the boat. But Comcomly's Indian tribesmen had been trailing them down the river, and were not far away. Out stretched the long red arms of the Chinooks, in spite of the tossing high waves, and caught the white men struggling in the water. Then they pulled them into their canoe. The Indians of the Columbia were expert oarsmen, but the partners had to go back to the old chief's camp and stay there until the storm was over, and that was 2 or 3 days. Shortly after their return to the ship, it was decided to build their little fort on the south side of the river upon a point they named Point George, just where the city of Astoria is today. The new post itself, however, they called Fort Astoria. Mr. John Jacob Astor of New York City was the head of the fur company, which was called the Pacific Fur Company, but usually his men were called Astorians. But the point selected was not a particularly good one, after all their trouble. The building of the fort was hard and dangerous work. Point George was on a steep hillside covered with enormous trees. Many were 200 feet high and more. Some were 6 and 8 feet in diameter. Every man had to begin tree chopping, whether he knew anything about it or not, and few did know how. The traders, the clerks, the canoemen, the Kanakas from the Sandwich Island, all went to work to clear the spot of these tremendous trees. Alexander Ross, and you will find him in other chapters of this book, tells the story of the building of Fort Astoria. First they picked out a tree they could get at, for the trees were all close together and the underbrush was high. Then they built a scaffold around it, so that they could stand above the rocks among the roots. 4 men would begin to chop such a tree, none knowing how. Some had short-handled axes and others long-handled ones. This made the chopping harder. Their guns they rested against a nearby tree while they chopped. But the woods around them were full of Indians, and every time they heard a rustling in the jungle of underbrush, they dropped their axes and picked up their guns. That made slow work. At last, after much toil, when the big tree was cut through so that it should fall, it would begin to topple over. But behold, it would catch at the top of another immense tree and hang there, a danger to everyone. There was not room enough for it to fall. Another would be cut and begin to fall in just the same way, catching in another tree. And so 3 or 4 of these great giant trees would hang together in most dangerous fashion. At last they would cut another, and then at last, when their weight carried them down, 2 or 3 or 4 trees would fall, all together, with a crash which echoed across the river and back again, and through the dense forests around them. Even then the logs were so big nothing could be done with them. They had to be blown to pieces with gunpowder, and the chunks rolled into the river. Several men were hurt by gunpowder accidents. Yet all this time these men, in turn, had to stand guard at night for fear of Indians. With all their toil and work and sleeplessness and the wet weather, they had no tents in which to sleep, and very poor food. They had only boiled fish and the roots which the Indians brought to sell to them. Worse than all, it was early in the spring, and the weather was wet and cold. Every other day was a day of rain, Ross said. Even when it did not rain, the lowering gray skies, the dreariness, made the men unhappy, and the damp fogs chilled them through. It was indeed a lonely spot, with the wide river in front, bordered on both sides with dark forests full of Indians. To the westward lay that terrible bar, and day and night they heard the fearful crashing of the breakers. To the eastward, somewhere, even though 2,000 miles away across mountains and deserts, lay the United States. So some of the men deserted, trying to get home overland. But the Indians farther up the river captured them as they trudged toward the Cascades, and made them slaves. Then the officer in charge, Mr. Duncan McDougall, had to buy them back with many gifts to the Indians. At last, with all their work, with the lack of sleep and of good food, in spite of the sullenness of McDougall and the scoldings of Captain Thorne, who lived on his ship and traded with the Indians, at last enough ground was cleared for their fort. A building was put up for a trading shop and as a warehouse for the supplies of all kinds. Then, on June 1, Captain Thorn cleared his decks and made ready for sailing on that coasting voyage for which he was so eager, and from which he never came back. The Indians attacked the ship at Clayoquot Harbor and massacred the crew and the captain as well. On June 5, the traders at Fort Astoria watched the Tonquin as she passed over the bar, all sails swelling, majestic and beautiful, but with her went their last chance of reaching the world outside. But there was no time to be lonely. There was not a stockade yet, that is, a high spiked fence of logs. This was put all around the buildings and a small bit of ground to protect them from Indian attack. This stockade was about 15 feet high. It was made so high and spiked so that Indians could not climb over it. At diagonal corners were 2 blockhouses of good-sized logs, which were 2 stories high. These blockhouses were built into the corners of the stockade so that they looked into the fort, and from them could be seen both sides of the stockade nearby. Men looking out from loopholes in the blockhouses could see and shoot at any Indian on either of the sides guarded by them, who might be trying to climb in the fort, or set fire to it, or break through it. The logs, which formed a picket fence, as one writer called it, were also the back logs of some of the cabins which were erected inside the fort yard. These smaller houses were dwelling houses for the men and partners, and blacksmith shop, and later on a hospital was built. For the inner walls of these buildings they needed smaller logs than the trunks of the great trees about the fort, so the men had to go back into the forest for these smaller trees. But there were no horses or mules or oxen, so the workmen had to harness themselves as animals, and 6 or 8 of them, pulling together, would drag a log out of the forest into the stockade. It was exceedingly hard work. Indeed, they worked so hard and so carefully that the next year, when the second ship, the Beaver, came in, with more supplies and more men, they had a fairly good fort. Inside the stockade, when the Beaver arrived, there were more dwellings for the men and a carpenter's shop, besides other storehouses. By this time the stockade was well guarded, as cannon had been put into the blockhouses, and muskets were kept in the second story to be used, if necessary, through the loopholes. Outside the stockade was a little garden, though it did not succeed well. Potatoes flourished, and a few turnips, but the mice ate all the radishes, and the turnips went to seed too quickly. The soil was too cold, and the weather too chilly for gardening at that point. But long before the Beaver came in that second year, the traders began to be worried because the Tonquin did not return. Late in the summer of 1811, rumors floated about among the Indians that she had been destroyed. Later, McDougall and other traders began to hear this. Things began to look serious. Behind these few cabins in this stockade rose a towering forest of spruce, firs, hemlock, and pine. The underbrush was so thick and dense that one could pass through it only on the Indian trails. And this forest, as well as the dense black woods all along the river on both sides, all about them everywhere, swarmed with Indians. They would be only too glad to kill the white men and capture the fort for the sake of the guns and bullets and powder, for the blankets and paint and copper kettles that were in it. At this time the friendly Indians began to be shy, which was a bad sign. Then great numbers of strange Indians came into Baker's Bay from the north. They were the sullen, savage, grim-looking Indians whom Captain Meares had seen around Tatoosh Island and the Straits of San Juan de Fuca. These Indians pretended they came for the sturgeon fishing, but they held long councils. Things looked serious indeed. Duncan McDougall saw the danger, and he was an old Indian trader. He at once called a council of all the chiefs of the nearby tribes. When they were all squatting on their heels in a semicircle, in Indian fashion, and had smoked their council pipe, he pulled a small bottle out of his pocket. McDougall handled the bottle with great care, and the Indians watched him keenly. "In this bottle," said Trader McDougall, "I hold a great sickness.
If I draw the cork, all of you will have it. But if you will be friends to the white men, I will let no harm come among you." The Indians quickly promised to be friendly. Perhaps the white traders saved themselves in this way. We do not know exactly. But this ruse was not nearly so pleasant or so funny as the one which Dr. John McLoughlin used at Fort Vancouver 15 years later. Later on, the traders knew the whole truth. How Captain Thorn was so rough with the Indians that he had angered them, and they had come on deck one day, pretending to sell furs, and when many were on shipboard they had killed the crew and the traders. Not a man remained to tell the story. The Indian interpreter who had gone with them told it, later on, to the Indians near Fort Astoria. After the Beaver came, it seemed as though all would go well. Fort Okanogan was built that first summer, 1811, and now, after the Beaver came in, Fort Spokane was built, 1812, and both these forts in the upper country were successful in trading. You will read about adventures there in later chapters. But the very year after that, 1813, because war had been declared between Great Britain and the United States, the Astorians were forced to sell their 3 forts to the Canadian fur traders, the Northwest Company of Montreal. They were shut off from all the world, since they had no ship and could not go home overland. The Indians were threatening again. Their trading goods were running low, and they could hardly buy food, and did not dare to use the goods in trading for furs. The sale of the fort has been called treachery, but it was not. If you visit Astoria today, in the park on the hilltop, you will find a fort built there, with a stockade of spiked logs around it. It is thought to be a close copy of that tiny fort built at Astoria 100 years ago. The first one, however, was built at the water's edge, with dense forests all around it. It looked out over the broad Columbia and the foaming breakers of the bar. If you look at it carefully, you will see what a very small fort it was to stand all alone in the Indian Territory on a wild, lonely coast. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, That Indian Thief. A small log cabin, a lonely man, a dog, and something else. What was the something else? That was what Alexander Ross did not know, and that was why he was frightened. It was the winter of 1811-12, the very winter after Astoria was founded, and it happened in this way. After the Americans had finished building, or nearly finished, Fort Astoria in the summer of 1811, they decided to build a new post on the upper Columbia somewhere. Just where, nobody knew. None of them had ever been there. But a rival company, the Northwest Company of Montreal, had come across the mountains and built a fort somewhere on the upper Columbia. In July of that year, therefore, the canoes were made ready for the men going up the river to found the new post. The clerks and partners did not know what sort of a voyage to expect, and some of them came to the river bank as though going on a picnic. One had a cloak and another his umbrella. Others had books and papers, intending to read pleasantly as the canoemen paddled them up the beautiful river. The sun was bright and the weather serene. Off they started in 2 Chinook canoes, each holding from 15 to 20 packs of trading goods, besides flour, rice, and other food, and tobacco. Each pack weighed 90 pounds. In the American party there were only 9, besides Indian canoemen. A third canoe was filled with men of the Northwest Company, who had come down to the mouth of the river when they heard white men were there. Alexander Ross was one of the clerks, and he tells the story. Going up that river did not prove to be a picnic. Troubles began at once. The wind rose suddenly, and so did the waves. When they reached Tongue Point, they had to unload the canoes and drag them across the portage there. When the wind died down a little, they started off again. But a second time the wind arose, and on rounding a point a few miles above, the waves drove them into a sandbank.
There they stuck, while water half filled the canoes, soaking everything. "Down came sail, mast and rigging about our ears," wrote Ross. Books and newspapers went to the bottom, umbrellas and cloaks were thrown aside. Every man had to help empty the half-swamped canoes and drag them into deep water again. As soon as they could get ashore, they built camp fires, dried their goods and their clothing, spent the night there, and started afresh the next morning. But it was hard work all the way up the river, and they went up hundreds of miles. Above the Willamette, where the current was swift, they had to keep close inshore and drag the canoes from point to point by the bushes and overhanging trees. At the Cascades they had to make a portage, or a carry, as well as at the Dalles, and again at Celilo Falls, because at these places the river was so swift and so rough they could not go upstream. And they had to unload their canoes, carry the goods overland, and the canoes as well, at these portages, in a land of thievish Indians, who tried constantly to steal small parcels of goods which they would rip out of the bales. After the Astorians had passed through the gorge of the Columbia, where the mountains seemed to have been split apart to let the river roll through, they found that they had left the forests behind them. This new country, east of the Cascade Mountains, was one of wide-rolling, treeless brown hills. Except as they bartered with the Indians, it was hard to get wood enough to cook their food, and the August sun was hot in this land of sand and sagebrush. After 6 weeks of paddling up the river, they reached the Okanogan, a pleasant river flowing into the Columbia from the north, and here the partner, Mr. Stuart, built his fort. His men cut down the cottonwood trees which bordered the Okanogan for this log cabin fort. There were no trees along the Columbia. Other logs were pulled from driftwood in a bend of the Columbia near by. The moment they landed and began their log cabin, Indians came about them. All talking was done by signs. Mr. Stuart and Mr. Ross opened a bale of tobacco, and Indians and white men together had a grand smoke. The traders opened also their bales of goods, and said by signs that these paints and cottons and blankets and kettles would be given in exchange for furs. The Okanogan Indians sent runners to other tribes, and soon throngs of Indians came and set up their teepees there, staying for several weeks and holding endless councils. By the time the visiting Indians went home, some furs had been traded and a start made on business. The cabin was almost finished, so Mr. Stuart sent 4 men back to Astoria to tell that all was well. He took 3 more with him and went north with trading goods. Alexander Ross was left alone with his little Spanish terrier, Weasel, in the unfinished log cabin. For Fort Okanogan was not really a fort at all. For several years it was nothing more than a log cabin, 16 feet wide and 20 feet long. Ross tells all about that winter. Although the Indians were friendly, he was a little afraid of them, and he was lonely. But it was a land of bright sunshine, of clear blue skies, even if it was also a land of snow and cold. Ross liked that, and he liked to look out on the 2 great rivers rushing by until winter came and they froze over. First, he patched up the house a bit, so he says. In the daytime he traded with the slow, never-hurrying Indians, and that took much time. They were shrewd traders, too, and knew exactly what they wanted. They asked for guns with which to shoot their enemies, as well as to hunt; kettles in which to boil water; looking-glasses; yellow and red paint for their faces; and for knives and blankets. The squaws wanted beads and thimbles, calicoes, and many other things. But the Indians were kindly enough to leave the fort at sundown and go to their own teepees. Ross then locked the door and tried to write down the Indian words he had learned during the day, and in the loneliness of that winter he says the Bible was a great comfort to him. But the nights were truly awful. All Indians are constantly in fear of some enemy creeping up on them in the night. The Okanogans were always possessed with this fear, so that if one of them heard the slightest sound in the night he would give the war-whoop. Others would quickly awaken and begin to yell and whoop. Yet there never was an enemy there. Ross never knew whether these nearby Indians were being attacked or not. He only heard the racket. But the uproar frightened him awake, and he expected every moment to see his door battered in. His hair grew gray, he says, because of his fears. Then came that something else. One night, when everything was quiet, Ross was awakened by Weasel's furious barking. The excited dog was dancing about on the cabin floor and racing up and down. Ross was certain that an Indian thief was in his cabin, but he lay perfectly still for a few moments, trying to think what to do. If he remained quiet, every Indian knew where his bunk was, and that would not save him. He thought of several plans. He could take the ramrod of his gun, which he had in his bunk, and poke up the fire, which was not far away. Yet if he stirred the hot ashes into a glow, the Indian would see him. Or he could fire into the dark, but he did not want to do that. At last he reached out and stirred the fire. It blazed up a little, and he saw no one was there. But Weasel was racing back and forth over a small trap door, barking furiously. Ross understood at once. Some Indian had found out about a little secret cellar he had made under the cabin, and was hiding there. Ross at once lit a candle and set it where the light would shine into the cellar. Then he took a pistol in one hand, and with the other cautiously lifted the trap door. Something was there. Something dark was sitting on a bale of tobacco. Ross fired. In another moment he knew it was no Indian. It was a skunk. But that was only the beginning. The Indians had been awakened by Weasel's barking. Then they saw the light and heard the shot. Something was happening to their friend, the white man. They rushed to his cabin, broke down the door, and poured into the little room. There, in the flickering candlelight, stood Ross with his smoking pistol, and at his feet the yelping, excited dog. They knew at once, of course, that he had shot a skunk, but being Indians, they didn't mind that. The serious thing was that they saw the secret cellar, with the bales of coveted tobacco and trading goods. Ross understood the mischief of that, but things quieted down after a while, and the Indians went back to their teepees. After that night the Indians began to be a little unfriendly. They would not hunt for furs. Strange Indians came about the fort and set up their teepees there. Long councils were held, day after day, while the old, friendly Indians became very shy. That was a bad sign. Ross understood the whole thing perfectly. They were plotting to get rid of him. Ross did at once the only safe thing to do. He called a council of the chiefs. They came in their paint and feathers, and squatted solemnly on their heels in a half circle. First they smoked the ceremonial pipe. Then Ross talked to them, partly in their own tongue. Mr. Stuart, when he left in October, had expected to return in 1 moon. 4 and 5 moons had gone by, yet he had not returned. Ross explained that this was because there were so many furs in the north country that Mr. Stuart had gone back to the white man's country by the Bitter Waters, Fort Astoria, near the ocean, for more trading goods. Yet Ross did not really know. He was himself afraid that Mr. Stuart had been killed in the north. The Indians waited. Sure enough, when spring came, down from the north came Mr. Stuart, loaded with furs. He had been snowed in all winter, 200 miles north of Fort Okanogan. Mr. Stuart had many furs. Ross brought out his. He had bought that lonely winter 1,500 beaver skins, besides other pelts. They locked up their log cabin fort and told the Indians to take good care of it until they returned in the summer. So in the bright May sunshine of 1812, with the light breeze blowing, they stepped into their canoes, loaded with furs, and paddled down the Columbia to Astoria. Several years after, when another fort had to be built, the fur traders changed the location. They built also a stockaded wall of spiked logs, inside of which were several houses. When the gates were locked, the Indians could not enter, but they were always friendly. They never did attack the fort. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, An Exciting Horse Race. "Cox," called Mr. Clark, the American partner in charge of Fort Spokane. "Cox, come here." Ross Cox dropped his work and went to where Mr. Clark was standing. The partner held an open letter in his hand, but he was looking out of the door with worry in his face. Cox, a clerk, a little red-headed, good-natured Irishman, knew at once it was something about furs. Now, this was little more than a year after Alexander Ross had been frightened by the skunk in the cellar. During that year the Astorians had built another trading post close to the Spokane House of the Northwest Company of Montreal, and not far from where the city of Spokane now is. It was keen work between the Americans and the Canadians to see which could secure the greatest number of furs from the Indians. "Cox," said Mr. Clark, "I have a letter from Farnham, who has been trading in the Flathead country. He says he is now at the Coeur d'Alene River. He has only a few furs now, but the Flathead Indians following him are loaded down with beaver skins. They will not sell except for tobacco, and Farnham has no tobacco." "And I suppose," answered Cox, "that the Spokane House trader is right there, too?" "Surely he is, but he is also out of tobacco. Farnham says whoever gets there first with tobacco will get the furs. You'll have to go at once." It was 11 o'clock in the morning then. Cox and Mr. Clark at once discussed the question of horses. "You can't reach there today," said Mr. Clark. "There isn't a horse that can travel those 72 miles before night." Cox thought for a few moments. "There isn't a company horse, Mr. Clark," he said at last, "but your horse, Le Bleu, could do it." Now Le Bleu, for his name was French, was a beautiful horse, white with bluish spots. He was 7 years old and a good racer. In summer, when the fur trade was dull, the Indians and fur traders used to race horses on the plains near the forts, and the Blue had won every race. But Le Bleu was Mr. Clark's own horse and a great favorite with him. He hesitated, but then said, "Well, take Le Bleu. We must get those furs." One whole hour was wasted in efforts to catch the Blue and 2 other horses for the men who were to go with Cox. At last they were caught and saddled. Just at 12 o'clock, off started Cox with his men for the portage across the Pointed Heart River, for Pointed Heart is the meaning of the Coeur d'Alene, as the old fur traders themselves explained. Literally, it means a heart of awls, because the Indians were such shrewd traders. The light-hearted French Canadians gave many a clever name in the Pacific Northwest to rivers, to mountains, and to Indians. Coils of rope tobacco hung from the pommel of Cox's saddle as he cantered off with his men, just a few minutes ahead of a similar party which he saw starting from the nearby Spokane House. It was going to be nip and tuck between the rival forts for those furs. It was indeed an exciting race. Cox, on his beautiful horse, sped swiftly along the hard Indian trail which wound for 60 miles across the rolling plains. At a distance lay the mountains, dark with the evergreen forests, but in the sunlight of that glorious May day they were only a soft mass of dark blue. On all sides stretched the sunlit country, green with fresh, tender grass and bright with shining patches of wild flowers, red and blue and yellow and white. A light, soft breeze was blowing, and the sky was very blue. On and on cantered Le Bleu through the glory of the springtime. On and on came Cox's 2 men, though gradually dropping behind. And behind them, racing over those same sunlit plains and along the same hard Indian trail, with tobacco coiled around the pommel of their saddles, came the 2 Canadians from Spokane House. They also were determined to secure those furs. Gradually the sun sank in the west, and Cox, glancing back, could not see the others. But now the easy part of the race was over. Ahead of him lay 10 miles through a thick forest, dark because the sun had set, and Cox did not know the trail. Yet Le Bleu's splendid horse seemed still quite fresh. So into the woods they went. Now, even in bright sunlight, the forests of the Pacific Northwest are dim because the great trees tower 200 feet or more, almost branchless, and topped with a soft green crown that keeps out the light. After sunset, the forests are very dark indeed. Cox at first tried to guide the horse, but again and again man and horse found themselves tangled in a dense undergrowth, or in brushwood, or trying to crowd between trees so close together the horse could not pass through. Again and again, right in front of them, lay the great trunk of some fallen tree, a gloomy mass in the forest blackness. They got off the trail so often that Cox began to be afraid the Canadians might win. They knew the trail well. Suppose they caught up with him, and even passed him? While he wondered, he was almost scraped off his horse by passing too close to a tree trunk. A moment later, a low-hanging branch of a stray poplar tree caught his head and shoulders, and almost lifted him off his horse. By that time Cox decided that Le Bleu knew that trail as well as he, for he did not know it at all. They were quite lost. So he held a loose rein and let Le Bleu go his own way. The horse quickly found the trail and kept it. On and on they went, slowly, plunging ahead into that dense darkness, while Cox wondered about the other men and the furs. Then suddenly out of that pitch blackness they came to the river. All along the bank were the graceful tapering teepees of the Indians. In front of a long line of campfires the river swirled and rippled, white with foam, after having dashed down the rapids above. It sparkled with the lights from the campfires. It was a pretty sight, the tiny campfires lighting up the darkness, gleaming in the river beyond, and making great flickering shadows to move among the tall trees. As the flames rose and fell, gigantic figures seemed to come and go among the tree trunks. Fox shouted when he saw those lights. Le Bleu lifted his drooping head and galloped up to Farnham's tent in fine style. Cox leaped off his horse, shouted to Farnham, pulled off the pommel the thick twists of rope tobacco, and instantly found himself the center of a throng of Indians, wild for tobacco. At the first sight of horsemen and tobacco they had rushed for him. Cox threw the tobacco to Farnham, and then took the saddle off the tired horse and turned the splendid fellow loose in some grass near by. Farnham directed the Indians to bring their furs to his tent. When they were safely stacked up, he gave tobacco to the red men. In an instant every head was lost in a cloud of blue smoke. The next morning the furs were sorted over and traded for in the usual way. 2 hours after Le Bleu came in, the Canadians from Spokane House galloped up the trail to that line of flickering lights along the river bank. Both they and their horses knew the way through the forest, and had kept the trail much better than Cox had, yet their horses were not so good. At midnight in came Cox's 2 men, and glad indeed were they to see the sparkling campfires. The next day the Canadians scolded the Indians for selling their furs to the Americans, because the Indians had traded with the Northwest Company, and had known them much longer. But the Indians said they were a very long time hungry for a smoke, and that they had a right to sell the furs to the first trader who brought them tobacco. So Le Bleu won the race, and the Americans won the furs. And the best of it was that the splendid horse was not injured by his hard run. After a week's rest he was as fresh as ever. When he went back over that trail with the fur traders and all those furs, he had no rider on his back, and took things quite at his leisure, one might say. End of Chapter 9.